Hi, I'm Charlie Campbell, East Asia Correspondent for Time. I'm delighted today to welcome Piyush Gupta, the CEO of Singapore's DBS Bank. We're going to be discussing how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting global banking and business, as well as opportunities to leverage the crisis to combat climate change. Mr. Gupta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, happy to be here, Charlie.
Thank you so much. Well, to dive straight in, I know that you've said previously that were you not working in banking, you'd be like to be involved in environmental conservation work. But these days, is there not a real opportunity to do both?
Actually, I believe it is. And so, frankly, we have a great platform as a bank to be able to make an impact, both in the context of climate, but also in the context of biodiversity. And so, fortunately, my personal interests and passions lead me there. I'm actively involved with some large conservation organizations as well. But certainly, from a banking standpoint, we've been trying to take the bank and our businesses and our thinking in a way that is a lot more sustainable over the last few years. So I agree with you entirely. As a general rule, I think the problem we have before us is so large that we can't just leave it to either the governments or the civil sector alone. I think corporations and the private sector who span jurisdictions and span countries, they have a meaningful role to play in addressing the problem at hand. And therefore, not just for us at DBS, I think for the whole private sector, it's incumbent on us to really try to do something and make a difference.
And so is it possible to foster investment in green technology that is truly competitive for investors while benefiting the world? Or does it always have to be some kind of trade-off with green investment?
I think, it's a spectrum. There are some components of the technology which are now getting to the place where they're economically viable. You take renewable energy, for example. The cost of wind and solar, not in every country, but in many countries, is now very competitive with traditional grid power. And so you could make sizable investments, as we do, in wind and solar projects without actually having to make a trade-off, either in terms of profitability or rely on government subsidies. However, there are still some countries where the cost economics don't work out. In the countries where either you don't get enough sunlight or don't get enough wind, or frankly, just the comparable cost of coal and oil is very, very cheap because there's an abundance of it. So in those cases, you are making a trade-off. But frankly, there's a bigger trade-off. And the trade-off has less to do with technology efficiency and where you've got to. That trade-off is more in respect of trying to trade off sometimes the short and the long term, or the issues around society and living well versus the health of the planet. One of the big problems is it's very hard for us to really understand externalities. While the world is getting its mind around the negative externalities, so carbon emission and so on, you've also got to be thinking about the positive externalities. So what happens in terms of giving food to starving kids, or putting light in somebody's home. If you, for example, to give an example, if you decide tomorrow to stop all kinds of electricity from fossil fuel, that could have some profound negative consequence for a whole generation from an economic development standpoint. So how do you make those trade-offs is not clear. And one of the things we're struggling with is trying to do what I call impact-weighted accounting. So weigh the positive impacts and the negative impacts of what you do. And truth be told, this is not easy. Sometimes you wind up thinking you're playing God, in fact. But to me, that trade-off is perhaps a bigger and more difficult trade-off than the economics trade-off you talked about.
DBS is Southeast Asia's biggest bank by assets and also one of the largest across Asia. What are the main challenges to initiating sustainable priorities at DBS? Do you still get some pushback?
Well, we've been down this journey now for a few years, and we have architected a program to make sure thinking about sustainability is embedded into the fabric of our business. And we do it around three pillars. The first pillar is really around what I call responsible banking. And that itself has, 2 or 3 dimensions to it. It is the nature of our financing. So what we choose to finance, what we choose not to finance. And there we are nuanced. There's some things we do more of, like I said, sustainable or green financing or renewables, and some things we do less of. Last year, we committed to stop doing any coal-based project financing, for example. A second dimension to responsible banking is around financial inclusion. And that is really how do you make sure you reach out to the unbanked, or at least the underbanked, There are over 1 billion people on this planet even today who don't have access to the formal banking system. And it's been well proven that access to the banking system makes a dramatic difference to people's lives, the capacity to save or the capacity to borrow. So that's the second thing we try to do. A third thing that we focused on is what I call trust. This idea of being fair, of having appropriate disclosure, of treating people in respect of their data and the privacy in the way they would like to be treated. That's the third dimension. We try to sort of package all of this under the first pillar of responsible banking. But we do have two more pillars. The second is our own business practices. And that relates to our own hiring policies, our own supply chain, our own carbon emissions, what we do about trying to be part of a circular economy, use less plastic, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the final pillar, which we focus on, which is really trying to make broader social impact. Many years ago, we figured that the right agenda for private companies is to really be thinking of a dual bottom line. It goes back to the impact-weighted accounting reference I made earlier. You have to be thinking about not just what you do from the P&L standpoint or a return on equity for the shareholder, but equally what you're doing in terms of other externalities and other impacts you make. And so we started supporting and advocating the whole industry around social enterprise and social entrepreneurship. People who are trying to push and promote a dual bottom line. And so we do that through skilled volunteering. We do that through a grant. Actually, we have a foundation which supports this. So we do that through lending programs and grants programs, etc. Now, the good news is that this is actually more and more integrated into the rhythm of our business. Our lending policies and our credit policies have embraced this. And so that's the positive. But the big challenges are the challenges I was referring to earlier. Challenge number one, quite clearly, mindsets are not easy to change. And oftentimes, our actions are driven by the asset owners, by the investors. And while there are some small investor groups who want to see our ESG agenda, by and large, the people who want to invest in us and buy our equity are still counting on a pure financial return. And so that mindset shift or a shift in the notion of what is true value, that's not easy. And it's going to take society some time to get there. A second shift is a second big challenge is the challenge of measurement. Charlie, the big issue is we don't know how to measure all of the things that we would like to measure. How much carbon gets created? How much carbon gets sequestered? What is the social impact? How many people are being put to school? It's really hard to do that. And while technology is developing, we're working on many projects to see if we can use modern technology and sensors and RFID, et cetera, to track some of these things. But finally, large part of it relies on ground truthing, boots on the ground to go and figure the real impact of what you do. And that's not easy. Second, the methodology, the science behind this has not been proven. And so there are 100 different ways and 100 different methods for measuring this. So frankly, there's no comparability at all. You don't even know sometimes what it is that you're trying to achieve. So that continues to be a big challenge as well.
So what is your message to other business leaders who may be reluctant to make significant changes to shape their businesses to be more sustainable?
My fundamental message is this. If you go back to the notion of sustainability, the Brundtland Commission or our Common Future report, I thought it said it pithily and well, which is the notion of sustainability is to make sure that we can cater to the needs of our generation while ensuring that we don't deprive future generations of their needs. I'm part of the EXCO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Our basic thing is that we think it's possible for 9+ billion people to live well on planet Earth by 2050 without actually violating the planetary boundaries, around whether it's carbon or gas emissions or the ocean systems, agriculture systems. You can do this in a way which is both by treating the planet and working through policies which are both regenerative and resilient. But at the end of the day, this is in our hands. When I say our, I'm saying our, generally speaking, it is the individual, it is the government and policymakers, but equally, and perhaps more than anybody, it is in the hands of the private sector and large corporations. We have a role to play. I've always believed in two things, Charlie. One, that when you get created as a private corporation, you're given life as a legal entity, you're given life and form. Now that life in form gives you some entitlements. It allows you to do things and it allows you to have, like I said, a legal status. But by the same token, it gives you a responsibility as well. You have to have the same consciousness and the same sense of obligation to society, community, and the future as an individual would. So I think we as corporations have to be able to play our role in that regard. The other thing which I often reflect on, says, the big debate in the last few years has been this issue of shareholder value versus, stakeholder value, shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism. And increasingly, it's fashionable to be critical of Friedman's doctrine of the primacy of the shareholder. In my own mind, I really don't think that there is a conflict per se. The challenge is a challenge of time frames. If you think short term, then obviously there is a conflict because you could take the extra dollar and return it to the shareholder as opposed to trying to do good for society, community, and all the other stuff. But the minute you extend your time frame and you make it a multi-year time frame or a 10, 20, 30-year time frame, or you start thinking like we do, that we want this company to be around for 50, 100 years, that conflict disappears. Because the only way you can be around is if you have a license from civil society to be around. And if you want to be around for the long term, you have to be relevant to society. Otherwise, you will not be given that license anymore. So it just seems to me that if you have a long-term view on shareholder value, then it reconciles very easily with a view to saying you've got to justify your existence. You've got to be relevant to community and society. Otherwise, you will not be able to create shareholder value in the long term. So my message to most of the business community is exactly this, that it's challenging, and a lot of the challenges I talked about are real, but we are running out of time. We said in 2010 as a community that the next 10 years is going to be critical because by 2050 we got to get a lot of stuff done, 2030 we got to get a lot of stuff done. In the last decade, we have come up with a whole bunch of commitments, the UN SDGs, the Paris commitments, the biodiversity commitments that we did in signed in Japan. In truth, 10 years on, we have not made adequate progress. In fact, I would go as far as to say we've made precious little progress. So the next 10 years are crucial because if we don't get this right, we will hit tipping point and then we won't be able to get this right. And therefore, we really have to make a big, big leap forward. And all of us, including the private sector, have to play a very significant role.
And so how is the pandemic shifting the global business landscape?
Charlie, a lot of people were concerned that the pandemic would take the agenda of sustainability and environment off the front burner. People would be a lot more concerned about the short-term challenges of health and epidemiology and the economy and so on. I sort of thought it might be different, and I think my hunch is proving to be right. I think the sustainability agenda is actually, if anything, getting a turbocharge. And it's happening for 2 or 3 important reasons. Reason number one, I think the pandemic brought to life for people the fact that tail risks do happen. Tail risks are not just 4 standard deviation events that you worry about as a hypothetical event. They can happen. And therefore, the fact that science tells us that climate change is happening and biodiversity loss is happening, it is really important for us to start paying heed to that. I think the pandemic has focused people's minds on the fact that you have to start dealing with that risk. A second thing that's happened is when you step back over the last 8 or 9 months, you think about the amount of resources we as a civilization have thrown at this problem. If you sum and total up all of the fiscal resources that governments had put to work, plus the monetary resources in terms of central bank support and so on, that's well over $25 trillion, well over a quarter of the world's GDP has been put to work in 6 months. If somebody had sort of suggested to you a year ago that we would find it within ourselves to generate $25 trillion of resources, I mean, it was impossible. But it's quite clear that when you have a gun to your head and your choices are limited, then you manage to do what it takes to find those resources. I think that's the second thing that people are beginning to recognize, that as we are putting resources to work, we better start thinking about resourcing for these other big risks that are on us. And I'm encouraged. If you look at the European Green Recovery Fund, a lot of that is already targeted at a sustainable economic agenda. And if you look at, for example, President-elect Biden's plans, at least his announced plans earlier, they have a substantial amount of commitment to a sustainable recovery agenda. And I'm seeing that everywhere. In Singapore, we have something called the Emerging Stronger Task Force, which I'm a member of. And as we think about Singapore's future emerging from the throes of the pandemic, a big pillar of our work is also around that. How do we build for a more sustainable economic system? So I do think that the pandemic in these important ways is causing people actually to accelerate their thinking on some of these big issues. Now, I'm not being naive. I think there will still be problems. In fact, in some places, it will get set back a little bit. But overall, I'm encouraged. Frankly, I've been getting more and more encouraged since 2016. I think COP21 in Paris was a game changer. But I think that the pandemic situation this year will certainly cause us to accelerate further.
You said that the public sector, like it or not, is going to get bigger given how much taxpayer money governments have pumped into the system due to the pandemic. What are the opportunities and the risks of this?
Well, the risks are obvious. We have seen in the past that when you have large public sectors, they tend to get bloated very quickly, and they drive a degree of inefficiency. In the extreme, you could argue that the Soviet Union example of a complete state-dominated and state-run economy really starts running out of steam and falls apart. But on the other hand, there are equally examples of state-owned capital, which tends to do relatively well. And even if you park China aside for a minute, the state-owned enterprises there, some of them are world-class. Closer to home, Singapore is a fantastic example. A large part of Singapore's economy is effectively held through Temasek and therefore in state hands. But the functioning of this is left to private methodologies and private enterprise. So the state doesn't interfere in the actual functioning of the system, though they do own a large part of the system, and the governance procedures allow that. The big positive, obviously, is this. My own view is that while market forces and market-oriented capitalism is generally good, Adam Smith's free hand, I do think that there is an important role for the government to play, because free market forces sometimes go overboard. And therefore, to establish a level playing field, establish competitive forces, establish the rules of the road, the OB markers, to make sure that you're making the balance between this generation and the next generation, I think policy is quite important. And I don't think the free market will ever trump the need for that good policy. Therefore, as the government start getting to be, I would call it more activist, I would prefer, rather than necessarily bigger, they do have a role to play in making sure that we shepherd the future development of the economy in the right direction. So I do think there is an opportunity. Frankly, I think the biggest opportunity in the coming decade is to reimagine PPP, public-private partnerships, where the private sector and the governments and civil society work together to achieve what are really meaningful outcomes. Referring back to Singapore, that's where I am. One of the things we figured with our Emerging Stronger Task Force is that there is a methodology to try and get everybody to participate in a common forum. It's almost like an agile practice in the private sector. So we've created a protocol called Alliances for Action. For every big agenda we want to take up, there is an alliance which includes the relevant agencies from the government, it includes the private sector, and it includes civil society. And we collectively get together to try and blueprint a course of action, which therefore then starts driving what government policy support is required, what the private sector should be doing, and how it's going to be relevant to society. And we're finding so far that this approach is actually very effective. So to my mind, if we can actually look to public-private partnership at scale around the world, I think you'll get superior outcomes.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. That was a fascinating and insightful discussion. Very grateful for your time.
Happy to do this, Shari.